And how many times today has someone welcomed you to this 32nd annual book fair for Miami Book Fair, right? My name is Carol Tulikangas, and I'm a volunteer room host, and I'm very pleased to be with you here this afternoon, and I'm glad you were able to join us. You know there are things going on all over. I hope you're having a wonderful experience at the book fair. And how many times today has somebody said, please become a member of Friends of the Book Fair, and has told you that you can text book and put in 5051 and they'll let you do a donation. Everything that happens with the book fair is done, I want to say through the kindness of strangers, except that they're friends, but the college, all of us who are volunteering, the businesses who help support us, and we need your support as well. The Miami Book Fair has things going on today, but this isn't the end of it. There are things that go on all year round. At the end of this conversation today, there will be an opportunity for you to have to ask some questions or make some comments. And after the session is finished, our author will be downstairs autographing books, and you'll be able to buy an autographed copy of the book. The other thing that, of course, is always important is to ask you to make sure your cell phones are on silence. Well, I have the opportunity today, I usually don't as a room host, to introduce our author, and I am proud to do this. Joyce Carol Oates has written some of the most enduring fiction of our time, including We Were the Mulvaneys, Blonde, which was nominated for the National Book Award, and the New York Times bestseller, The Accursed. She's published over 40 novels, as well as a number of plays and novellas, and many volumes of short stories, poetry, and nonfiction. Oates is a recipient of the National Medal of Humanities, the National Book Award, and the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in Short Fiction, among others. The Last Landscape, published by Echo, is Joyce Carol Oates' vivid chronicle of her hardscrabble childhood in rural western New York State. In this exceptionally candid, moving, and richly reflective account, she explores the world through the eyes of her younger self, an imaginative girl eager to tell stories about the world and the people she meets. With searing detail and an accurately perceptive eye, she renders her memories and emotions with exquisite precision, transporting us to a forgotten place and time, the lost landscape of her youth, reminding us of the forgotten landscapes of our own earliest lives. Interviewing Joyce Carol Oates today will be Clay Smith, who is the editor-in-chief of Kirkus. We have until about 20 minutes after 1 at the very latest. By 1:15, I'll be letting you all know that we have 5 minutes left, just so you understand what the time schedule is. Go ahead, thank you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome, Joyce. Thanks for being here. Obviously you all know that Joyce is the author of many books. We're here really to talk today about her latest book, which is called The Lost Landscape, A Writer's Coming of Age. And one of the interesting observations, you don't just write about your own life, but you write also about memoir as a form of writing. And one of the things that you say is, quote, the effort of writing a memoir is fraught with peril and sort of tinged with this melancholy. So why did you persevere?
Well, this is the second memoir that I've written. The first is called, can you hear? No? How did you know what I asked? You hear selectively. Can you hear that? Can you hear this? I guess if I lean really close. Oh, thank you. It just takes a man to sort of figure things out. Oh, thank you very much. Now they can hear me? Well, why did I write this? At this moment, I actually am sort of blank. I'm not sure. Well, I wrote this over a period of about 15 years, actually. I think that what happened was that, like many of us, I've had a sort of haunted relationship with my own childhood. And I love to look through old photographs and reminisce with my parents. When they came to visit, we would have these photographs, and some of them we would look at so many times. I mean, many of those are in the book. My father with his small airplanes that we flew in, and my mother and myself with kittens and with little chickens and so forth. So I think at some point, an editor probably invited me to write about a childhood memory based on a snapshot. I know that was maybe the genesis of the whole book, but this was a long time ago when the editor asked that. It might have been for a magazine like, I'm just guessing it could have been, for instance, Life magazine or the old Saturday Evening Post. Could have been the Smithsonian. I know the New Yorker asked me to write about my first experiences working, as a child and a teenager, what sort of jobs I had. So that led to one of the essays, which is in longer form and turns out to be hilariously funny in this book. Hilariously funny in retrospect. At the time, the jobs that I had were not so much fun. One of them was a cleaning woman. I mean, it was a girl, so I did that once. And another time, I was invited by the New York Times Magazine to write about both my parents. First my father, then after a while my mother. And so each one of these chapters was originally a suggestion by an editor, going back for many years. And I remember one of the more recent was Conjunctions Magazine had a special issue on animals. What is one's relationship to animals. So I read about a chicken. It was my pet chicken when I was a really little girl, called Happy Chicken. And I started thinking about Happy Chicken and looking through snapshots, and I thought I would write about the experience from the point of view of the chicken. So I did that, and that was one of these. So in answer to your question, basically, it was an amalgam of very different moments and points of view and perspectives, and then getting the idea of putting them all together after both my parents had passed away. It's kind of a memorial to them, I think, to the really wonderful generation of people now passing away, my grandparents also.
Yeah. In fact, you write that it's, quote, difficult not to feel unworthy of your parents, and they came of age in the Great Depression. Is it really, though, just because, I mean, there's a lot of love in this book for your parents. Is it just because they were hard workers and came of age in the Great Depression that you felt that unworthiness?
Well, I'm not sure if unworthiness is the only element, I think when one is interviewed, the questions are sometimes pinpoint something which are they're accurate, but they're narrow, It's probably a very generalized, many different emotions that I felt. But my parents were possibly representative of their time, too. I think of my mother, who was not at all educated. Both my parents dropped out of school in 8th grade. But I think of my mother, who was not educated, as a very intelligent woman, really, and intuitive, very warm, with an instinct for having a family and creating things like sewing and knitting and crocheting and things that women have done over the ages that are creative and sometimes very beautiful, but are not heralded. There's not that much about them in the world. And my mother sort of, I think, belongs to that world of women who didn't have jobs and did not have careers, but they had families and they had a lot of work to do. And so women like that exude a tremendous influence in a small sphere, but they don't have the larger global identity, And I've often written about women like that, so there's a whole homage, I guess, to my mother. Then my father, too, seemed representative. He was a person, again, he was not educated, but he was very intelligent, and they both read my writing, and they both said that they understood the novels. And my mother would always say, "This is the best novel I've ever read." And I would say, "Well, Mommy, do you mean all novels?" She said, "Oh, yes, all novels." Then the next novel would come out, "This is the best novel." And my father took courses at the University of Buffalo after he retired from being a factory worker, and he took courses in English and American literature, and he was reading lots of different books, but it was always my books. These are the best books, So they were tremendously supportive parents. I don't know if they were literary critics exactly, but they were very supportive to their daughter.
There's a great chapter here near the beginning of the book about Alice in, Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. And given that we're at a book festival, I just wondered if you might mind reading from it.
Thank you, that's such a great idea. Well, Alice in Wonderland was my first book. My grandmother, who is my father's mother, gave me many books, and this was the first book that I really remember, and I was just 9 years old, so it's a long time ago, sort of deep prehistory. It's like a world where dinosaurs were moving around, you know. I went to this one-room schoolhouse that my mother had gone to, and people sort of stare at me in pity and terror. I went to a one-room schoolhouse. It's all sort of part of the American past, and it seems like I feel like a pioneer, and yet it wasn't really that long ago. So my grandmother turned out to be, and this is explained in the book a little bit, she turned out to be Jewish. Now, she didn't tell people that her family was Jewish, not even my father, who technically speaking was also Jewish because he was her son. But my grandmother was from a family that emigrated from Germany probably in the 1890s. So they left Europe, which they saw to be a troubled place for them, evidently, and they settled in upstate New York, which suggests the desperation with which they left, because if they had had a whole lot of sense, they would have settled in some Jewish neighborhoods like in the Lower East Side in New York or in Boston, you know, where they had people like themselves. Instead, for some reason I never understood, they went all the way to upstate New York where there are no Jews at all. And when you get there, you see why there were no Jews there. It was sort of a forlorn and very cold place and not known for its educational possibilities. So for some reason, they settled in this area north of Buffalo. And many people think there is no north of Buffalo. There's actually a north of Buffalo. It's south of Lake Ontario. So my grandmother always gave me books, and then she gave me a typewriter. She gave me a toy typewriter first, and then a real typewriter. And then retrospectively, I mean, looking back on it from after she died and was revealed that she was Jewish, it sort of fits in with the whole idea of the Jewish emphasis on books and revering education and being a writer and all that. At the time, it just seemed, well, Joyce's grandmother is this person who gives books to people, and like she's the only person we knew who had a library card. She's the only person who read quite a bit. So only in retrospect that sort of fitted into place. So the first book that she gave me that I really remember is Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. And these are books, I still have the actual book, it's about this big, it's illustrated. It's on my shelf at home, and when in my study I just turn around and I sort of see it there, and it gives me a kind of emotional feeling. So I have just a little chapter which I'll read about that. Discovering Alice, 1947. The singular book that changed my life, that made me yearn to be a writer as well as inspired me to write, is Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. This beautiful, slightly oversized book, I used to remember it as a giant book. I really thought it was like this big book, but actually it's sort of like a normal-sized book. But I can't just call it normal, so in here it's called oversized. A gift of my Jewish grandmother, Blanche Morgenstern, for my 9th birthday. I mentioned here my book-loving grandmother gave me many, many books for birthdays and Christmas, always a book. So I was starting to read when I was very young. And the other great book of my childhood, which I don't talk about here, is Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden, and maybe some of you know. To this day, I treasure and keep it on my bookshelf. The illustrations of Alice by John Tenniel are among her bizarre Wonderland world, depict her as surprised and sometimes intimidated by that world, but never overwhelmed by it. The great illustrator Tenniel gave to Alice a commonsensical gravity and a tender sobriety, quite unlike most illustrations of children in American contemporary children's books. So when I read Alice, I was just a little girl on a farm, and not a prosperous farm in upstate New York. We didn't know any prosperous farms. I guess we didn't understand that our farm wasn't prosperous because we had never seen a prosperous farm. So I had this book about this English girl. Now, I can see now that she was pretty upper class. They had servants, and they ate things like crumpets and curds and whey and all these weird things that I'd never heard of. And there were footmen and odd things like that, kings and queens and jacks and croquet, all these things. I could have had no idea what they were, but it's just sort of part of being a child where you accept things and as part of the imagination. Alice is a girl who, if you remember from the Alice books, she has many nightmare experiences. They're quite terrifying. And once she shrinks way down, and she thinks, oh, am I about to go out, And then she nibbles from a mushroom, and she gets really, really tall, and her head sort of hits against the ceiling, and her neck is very long. And all these things are really fraught with anxiety for children. I think I don't remember having been this young, but I would think a really young child is sort of overwhelmed and intimidated by the physicality of tall people surrounding her or him, so that you're always sort of looking up at these giants. And children's books like Alice in Wonderland reflect that kind of unease, that you need these giants to protect you, but at the same time they're physically so large. And then if you remember, the Alice books also have many episodes of trauma, which we would call trauma today, where Alice is almost eaten. There's a fear that some creature is eating. And many of the little chapters that are humorous limericks and poems have to do with being eaten. One of them, the Owl and the Panther, is all this rhyme. It's kind of cheerful, but at the very end it says, and then the panther made a meal of, and then it stops. And obviously the panther eats the owl. And the walrus and the carpenter are walking along the sand, and all the little oysters are coming after him, and they all follow him, and then they eat all the oysters. And the child identifies with the little creatures, I think. So when I was reading Alice as a girl, I was obviously experiencing some of these anxieties and an imaginative level. But the point of the Alice books is that she's never terrified. She confronts terrifying experiences, but she herself is not terrified. And she's not really bossed around. She's a girl who speaks her mind, as I would never have been a child who did that. Few children are encouraged to do so, but Alice has sort of put down her foot, with these Wonderland creatures. And I was too young to comprehend the underlying themes of Alice's astonishing adventures. But later on, many years later, I taught Alice in Wonderland at Princeton University, and rereading it, I see as very much about what was in the air at that time, scientific ideas of, theological ideas of Darwinian evolutionary theory, which was confronting the whole idea of a special creation, and Christian theology. And Darwin was very much in the air, and Lewis Carroll was very much on the scientific side. And so survival of the fittest through the process of natural selection, which is a very pitiless and still a controversial issue in the Victorian era, represents a challenge to conventional Christianity, one not entirely resolved in the 21st century. It's kind of interesting, this whole division even now in the United States today with some of the issues that are dealt with in Alice in Wonderland. Is there a special creation, or is it the Darwinian materialist vision? So I didn't know any of that at the time I was reading this. Like any child in rapture with a favorite book, I wanted to be the book's heroine. I wanted to be Alice. It must have occurred to me that Alice was very unlike any girl of my acquaintance, belonging to this foreign world. I think I learned from Alice to be just slightly bolder than I might have been, to question authority, that is, adults. I've always retained that, to question authority. Now I am authority myself, which is sort of embarrassing. Like, I'm a professor, but at the same time I would say, students should question authority. That's the embarrassing thing for people who are skeptical, like, was it Bob Dylan and others who said in the 1960s, never trust anyone over 30. And then suddenly it gets to be embarrassing when you're well over 30. So anyway, that I think Alice was a model. I was prepared to recognize fear, even terror, without succumbing to it. There are scenes of nightmare illogic in the Alice books, numerous dramatizations of the anxiety of being eaten. I remember the very ending of the Alice Through the Looking Glass is a big banquet table where the human creatures are going to be eaten by the leg of mutton is coming down, and the queen has disappeared in the soup tureen. Like, the people who thought they were going to be eating the food are actually going to be eaten themselves. And that's really pretty profound on a nightmare level. But Alice triumphs. If you remember, she wakes up. Both books, she wakes up, and it's just a dream. So that's how she escapes. There are never any adults, no family, no mother or father. It's just basically Alice on her own, and she wakes up. But she never loses her common sense and dignity. It did occur to me that Alice is a character in the book, not telling her own story, and the author of the book was named on the title page Lewis Carroll. So becoming Lewis Carroll was an aspiration to me, and I was drawing stories in the mode of these illustrations. Cats and chickens. I couldn't draw people, so the cats were on their hind legs, and the chickens were on their hind legs also. So they seemed to be always kind of like at a cocktail party or something that they were doing together. I'm not sure. So these were novels on lined tablet paper that captivated me for long hours as a child. Out of Alice's adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass was sprung not only much of my enthusiasm for writing, but also my sense of the world as an indecipherable, essentially absurd, but fascinating spectacle about which it's reasonable to exclaim with Alice, curiouser and curiouser. So that's sort of the foundation of my philosophical belief. Do you believe that too?
I do.
That the world, especially with the GOP candidates. Had to get that in. This is right out of Alice in Wonderland, like one after another. They're just sort of these characters that you couldn't make up.
So you got a library card after the Alice experience, and was it sort of a love affair with books right from the get-go?
Absolutely. I love books, and I love to look at books. I love to design books. And at Princeton University, where I teach an introductory course in writing, my students design their own books. They have assignments every week, so they do a lot of writing. So over the semester, they've accumulated, actually not that much, but it looks like they've accumulated enough for a book. So then they design a cover, they design their author photo, and their little biographical note they have to write, and little things. They basically have to create a book. And so we're all excited about seeing what they're going to come in with, and it's due at the end of the semester next month. So I really like books, and when I had my library card, that was really one of the events of my life. My library card that would allow me to take out books. And before that, we didn't have any, we had virtually no books in the house, except what my grandmother gave me.
Right. One of the startling sentences in this book for the reader is, you write, quote, "I have to concede that I scarcely remember myself as a child." And that's kind of surprising for the reader because this book is full of vivid details, and you use senses in a really nice way. Can you talk about that sort of literary effort of resurrecting a past that you may not remember every detail of?
Well, Clay, it's probably the same with you. If you close your eyes, and everybody close your eyes, you can sort of see your childhood room, like the first room you were ever in. You can sort of see your parents' faces when they were very young, or your grandparents. You can sort of see the backyard, or your first dog, or something. You can sort of see these things almost exactly, you know, you can really see them in your brain somewhere. But you don't see yourself, I don't think, because you're remembering what you saw through your eyes. You're not remembering yourself. So I think that we are a succession of vivid, sharp memories, and some of them are olfactory. The sense of smell is very strong. So in my life, the smell of lilac, there was a lilac tree right outside our house, many lilac bushes actually, but a lilac tree that I climbed up in and I would sit there. So the smell of lilac completely brings you back to this tree, I mean, like in a second. And the deepest part of our brains are the oldest memories, and they will be activated by smell and also by music, like this little lullaby or something, you're captivated. The cognitive part of our memories, that is the more intellectual part, is much more tenuous and superficial compared to these deep memories. So when I say I don't remember myself much as a child, I'm basically speaking for all people. Now, some people will confabulate, and that's a psychological term, you probably know what it means. It means that you're providing a plausible memory for something that you don't actually remember. But you think it must have been like this. So you're remembering, not exactly literally, but once you start confabulating, in a way, you consolidate that memory. I'm using terms that are sort of neuroscience terms. You're consolidating a false memory in your brain and making that your memory. So we have this phenomenon today with people who are in the public eye, who are politicians and other people who are public figures, and they've obviously been confabulating a lot of their lives. Now, you mustn't laugh because we all confabulate. I think that's something that has to be understood. Everybody with a brain is going to confabulate because you don't really remember. You don't really remember. Somebody will say, oh, do you remember this present you got when you were 4? And you don't really remember it. You say, yes. Or you see a snapshot, or you sort of see something. So the confabulations are harmless in our lives. But when you go into public life, where you're starting to get examined for every little thing you say, then it seems like you're lying or inventing. And I think that's really not fair. I'm not defending anybody particularly. I'm just saying that it's a little bit misleading. I'm actually married to a neuroscientist, so there are things about the human brain the human brain is very wonderful and extraordinary, but very flawed. And people have many false memories that they don't know. People have very many powerful, strong feelings of bias and bigotry that they have no idea why they have. And they're sort of silly, but they've inherited them by things that they heard when they were children. So they have these strong, angry feelings of something. If you were to examine them logically, they couldn't explain any of it. They say, well, I don't know, it's a gut feeling or something like that. So when I say I don't have a sense of myself as a child, I think it's just being kind of honest about it. And when I try to make my memories out to be maybe composite memories, like I write about the girl who lived next door, who is my close friend, but I don't write about maybe 3 or 4 other girls who were friends. So I'm choosing to write about friendship as a child. I can't write about too many people. So the act of memoir is always an act of selection. So that's like you're omitting things. I wrote about one grandmother quite extensively, so I didn't write about my other grandmother much at all. And I wrote about one girl from high school who was a friend, but I didn't write about other girls. And then when I went to college, I didn't write about a number of things. So I try to explain that in the afterword of the memoir. It's not that memoirs are false, but they can't give the whole truth because they'd be like 15,000 pages long.
Yeah. But the memories that do remain seem so strong. Like I'm thinking of the episode where you write about walking underneath the bridge and there were fishermen
Yeah.
on the other side of the bank. And, nowadays, there are these news stories about parents letting their children play in the park and the children get arrested. You would wander and wander. So the memories that do remain must be very vivid to you because
Oh, yes, they're very vivid, yeah. Well, I played down by what we call the creek, and we always lived nearby the Erie Barge Canal, which is in Lockport, New York. And all my writing, if you read any of my writing, there's always a creek and the canal is usually there. Those are really touchstones in my life. But I think it's true to touch upon your other remark. Somebody was saying last night, it was Marlon Jones, actually, Marlon James, this wonderful writer who just won the Booker Prize. Marlon James was saying that as a professor, he's confronted with helicopter parents who hover over their children and don't let them wander anywhere, but also bulldozer parents, which is I never heard of before. Bulldozer parents are even worse than helicopter parents. They bulldoze the way for their children. They just sort of bury everybody, and the children are very protected and sequestered. Now, I come of age at a time when young people, teenagers, would hitchhike on the road, and hitchhiking was very common in America. Now hitchhiking would seem very extreme, and you'd probably be arrested. Your parents would be arrested, you'd be taken away and put into child custody or something. We also wandered all over. I always explored and wandered and had such a great time. I remember with my girlfriend, and maybe my brother's 5 years younger than I, just sort of wandering around like down the lane along the creek and just sort of playing, and nobody was watching us and nothing bad ever happened. And so that I just remember that so clearly. Then when I went to Lockport, New York, on a Greyhound bus, I went to school in Lockport after a while, I would also wander around Lockport. So my happiest moments, I just remember walking by the Erie Barge Canal, looking down at the canal and hearing the water, walking along the sidewalks, looking at the store windows. And when you're only like 11 or 12 years old, just sort of wandering around and looking at things. And to me, that was so wonderful. And that really laid the groundwork, I guess, for being a writer, because there are whole novels of mine that are sort of based on, because it is bitter and because it is my heart, very much there's scenes in that novel that are from my childhood when I would be wandering around and being given like $1, and that would allow me to have my lunch. And I would go to a restaurant and buy my own lunch. And I was just a little girl, and it was so exciting. And I remember writing about that years later, that feeling of being alone. But I gave the experience to a fictitious person. It wasn't about me. So a lot of the things I'm talking about, though they were my experiences in my writing, they're given to fictitious people.
But so much of your childhood does seem to be this kind of iconic America that doesn't exist anymore, even to almost a stereotypical degree. I mean, you mentioned the one-room schoolhouse. You have this really nice chapter about the Sunday drives.
Yes.
You
Yes.
grew up with chickens and
Yes.
barnyard animals. Your father worked in manufacturing. I mean, is that an America that you miss?
Well, everything you name it does sound sort of extinct, but that wasn't, I didn't really think of that when I was writing it much. Actually, the whole vogue for raising chickens is coming back. There are a lot of people who are raising hens, raising their own eggs and so forth. So I have a whole soft spot in my heart for hens, and I like even a rooster. There's a whole lot about Mr. Rooster in my memoir. So after I've given a few readings from my memoir, and people come up to me and say, "Oh, I come from a family where we had chickens and we had a rooster." So there's a whole lot of America that maybe is vanishing, but maybe coming back in a sort of limited way. But I also have a chapter about my sister who's autistic. And when my sister was born, which is a long time ago, the idea of autism as a mental problem or biochemical disorder that was not known at all, so it was not clear if she was retarded or what was wrong with her. But now there's a whole science of autism, and a lot has been discovered. So my chapter on my sister sort of leaps ahead to the present time. One of my friends and colleagues at Princeton University, Professor Samuel Wang, W-A-N-G, he's actually doing remarkable work in autism, and he's publishing and so forth. So I've sort of seen the whole gamut of theories about autism from the very beginnings, when it was just thought maybe it was like retardation, to now it's seen to be a confluence of a number of possibilities, but it's biochemical. So that's one example of something that I definitely have seen a whole change. And then the phenomenon of sexual harassment, molestation, sexual threats against girls, and bullying, all that has come out into consciousness now, is talked about a lot. When I was a girl, those things went on, but there were no names for it. Like even the word bullying is somewhat new, like the last maybe 10 years or so. But there were certainly bullies. I mean, there were bullies, and they were mean and malicious. And it wasn't necessarily, I suppose, that they were evil, but they were doing things that were very hurtful to young children. And not just girls, but boys too. It was sort of, if you were little and powerless, then these older, larger children who tended to be boys, they would do these things. So I write about that, and again, I've sort of seen the whole evolution of an attitude toward that, where in the old days, you would be told, well, they're just teasing, or they don't mean anything. Like, don't cry, they're just teasing. To now, you'd be taken seriously, and a bully would be, I hope, would be dealt with.
The one thing we can all assume when we buy a memoir is that a lot of it is going to be in first person. I did this, I did that. And you have that, but you also do this thing that I find really fascinating, that within the first 15 pages, you have already inhabited two other characters, the voice of your father and the voice of this chicken, Happy Chicken, who was your beloved
Happy
pet.
Chicken was my beloved chicken.
Is it just out of a sort of narrative restlessness, or talk about where that idea to, in memoir, to inhabit another person's point of view came about?
I don't have a whole lot from my father's point of view. Some of it is a letter that he wrote to me, and there's a little bit from my brother writing about my sister. I mean, my brother's letter is really short, but my father's voice, I would put in italics, but. And then the chicken I wrote from the point of view of the chicken, and this is a chapter most people talk about for some reason, because it's so unusual to be reading a chicken's words, It's not often you can say, well, I'm reading a memoir written by a chicken. That's quite unique, actually. But the reason I did that was I was only between 2 and 5 years old at the time of this chicken. And so my own point of view would be very limited. But I give to the chicken a mythic, almost impersonal, visionary power, where the chicken can name things in the family, and like what my father and grandfather did. They worked in factories and so forth. And the chicken can look into the future. I mean, a chicken has a sort of mythic power, like in a children's narrative, that the little girl really wouldn't have. I mean, it wouldn't make much sense if the little girl could see into the future the way the chicken does. Right. And I was interviewed about this not long ago by a wonderful interviewer, Leonard Lopate. He's quite well known, actually. Perhaps you've heard of Leonard Lopate. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Leonard said to me about my chicken, he said, Joyce, don't you think that you probably ate Happy Chicken? And I was stunned, because the Happy Chicken does disappear, and we looked all over for him. But my grandmother, she was the one who killed chickens. We had this chicken farm, and I gathered eggs and so forth. But my grandmother sort of, my Hungarian grandmother, she was the one who like chopped heads off chickens, and I pretended not to know about that. So, and so Leonard said, well, you probably ate Happy Chicken. I said, no, no, how could you say that? I was sort of having a meltdown. I said, how can you say that? I'm not prepared to think. I don't think, no, I can't believe. So I'm hoping that Clay will not ask me the same question. So,
No, but we do have to talk about murder.
poor chicken.
So your mother's father was murdered. And the nice sort of observation you make in the book is how crime sort of reverberates through years and through the lives of people who had absolutely nothing to do with that crime. Did you, your mom would never really talk about the crime. I mean, did you have to go back and do research, or what was it like for you to kind of resurrect that whole episode?
Well, like many families, there were secrets in the family and things that my brother and I did not know about. And I remember going into a room and the adults would be very quiet. You know, you went like, what are they talking about? And I think that's part of what made me be a writer, to sort of formulate ideas about what people might have been talking about. And many of my novels have crimes in them, sort of that go back like a generation or so. Well, I was pretty middle-aged at the time, and my mother was elderly, and she was about 81 or so. So Oprah magazine had a feature, and the idea was that women writers would interview their own mothers. And I thought I was invited to do this. Like many of the things I was mentioning, that editors of magazines invited me to write something, so they sort of added up to this memoir. So I thought I would call my mother on the phone, because when we saw my parents, my father was always there. My father and mother had a very nice marriage, but my father was very dominant. He is a lovely, lovely, protective man who never knew he was so dominant. Like my mother was a lovely, passive, sort of quiet, loving, very warm person, but not assertive. She was not an assertive person. So if there was an opinion in that family, it was my father's opinion, you know, and my mother might have an opinion, or maybe she didn't even have any opinion. So if we were with the two of them, my father would sort of dominate. And I'm not sure that's that unusual. That's just the way it was. So I thought I'd call my mother on the phone, and then we'd just have a conversation between the two of us. And that made all the difference in the world. I said, Mommy, I've been asked to do this sort of strange, weird interview that we're interviewing our mothers, so asking you about your childhood. And so my mother started telling me, suddenly she started crying. She said, well, I was given away. And then she just went on and she told this sad story, which she didn't know about. She didn't know why her father had been murdered exactly. It was in a fight. It was in a tavern fight when her father was working at a factory in Buffalo, New York, a Hungarian neighborhood. So she was 9 months old, I guess, and there were 8 or 9 children in the family, and I don't even know how many there were. It was a huge family, a huge Catholic family, and they were very poor. And then the father was murdered, so they were really poor. So the mother, the desperate mother, gave away at least one child, and that was my mother. So there may have been other children who went to live somewhere else. So my mother was given away as a baby, and she was given to a childless couple. And this came out in our conversation. But all my mother could say was, my mother didn't want me. And she was crying. I said, oh, Mom. And I said, so, oh, what have I done? You know, it was like, 70 years later, or no, 80 years later. So, like 80 years later, and anyway, it was just one of these things. So that came out, and I wrote about that. And I realized that my mother, who had been always so warm and loving and had a wonderful family, that at the back of her mind, she thought that her mother didn't want her. And I said, well, your mother probably wanted you, but she couldn't she couldn't afford to keep you. So that was very sad. But then my mother went on to say, well, after a while, her biological mother did live not too far away, so she would try to walk back there, and they would say, go away. Says, go away, you live there, you don't live with us, you belong there. So it was like a really bad fairy tale. So anyway, I've written about this a few times, about someone who's given away. But it all turned out really well because the family she went to live with didn't have any children. So she had much better situation in every way. And then eventually she met my father, whom she wouldn't have met if she'd stayed with the other family. So I wouldn't have been born, and my brother wouldn't have been born. I know that sounds sort of trivial. But when my brother and I talk about it, like we came pretty close to not being born, because if my grandfather had not been murdered, all this wouldn't have happened.
Yes, someone else's catastrophe
Yeah.
means that you are here.
And probably if you look back in your own life, there's some little thing that happened that you don't even know about that wasn't so good for somebody, but it turned out to be good for you.
Yeah. So we've got time for a few questions from you all. There's a stand here, or if you're really obnoxious, you can just yell it out.
Actually, I think that Gravedigger's Daughter is probably maybe the saddest book ever written. But then it had this fantastic epilogue when the character's reaching out to the woman who had cancer, I guess Rebecca. And I've always wondered why you did that at the end. And I know how I felt about it, but I was kind of wondering what you were trying to accomplish with it.
This is the Gravedigger's Daughter?
Yeah.
That's actually about my grandmother, my Jewish grandmother,
I didn't know that till now.
who couldn't say that she was Jewish. That's very close to my heart. I waited till my grandmother passed away before I wrote that novel. And then I remember finishing the novel, I put it in a drawer, and I thought, I can't even look at it for a year. And then I finally took it out and reread it. And to me, I can hardly read the final chapter. I really just get kind of tearful when I think about it. So that's all I can say.
Well, I do too.
Thank you, I guess.
Hi, Joyce. So I'm a college student, and I've taken fiction classes. I want to be a writer, and I've taken creative writing classes. And throughout all my years I've read your Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been short story like 3 times now, because everybody loves it and everybody thinks it's great, and it is a fantastic story. But when you look at it from a literary perspective, and you have Arnold Friend, and you have all the the things that he does with Connie. There's all these little things that I guess people speculate that are in the story in terms of the license plate, if that is in any way referring to biblical verses. And there's a bit about if you take the R's out of his name, it spells out an old fiend. And
You should
also-
actually read this book, because she writes about just
And
what
I
you're
was,
asking.
because I was kind of curious how many of those things that you put in there were purposeful versus how many of them were just accidents.
Well, that's a good question. I think when you're writing a story over a period of weeks, let's say, first you have like the skeletal outline of the story, and it's pretty thin and so forth, but I always have the ending.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start sort of filling it in, and then it's time to describe the car.
Mm-hmm.
And the car, I wanted to have mythic suggestions, and it's like a false guilt,
Yeah, it makes it
gold,
really interesting to
it's
read.
like, it suggests gold, but it's actually kind of cheap material. And then the license plates and little things like done by woman driver or something. All those things start getting added maybe afterward to make it richer. So a lot of those are fairly deliberate, They are deliberate, but I think of writing prose fiction is like writing poetry, that the reader should sort of contemplate it.
Mm-hmm.
Like an old fiend is a plausible and reasonable extraction, to get from that. And there are other things like that in the story that are sort of put in there deliberately.
That's cool. Thank you.
And here's this nice lady with the crook. She's about to pull us off the stage. Do you want us-
We do need to stop because there's another group that's coming in here at 1:30. Now, Joyce Carol Oates will be downstairs signing books. If you go down the escalator, turn to the left, and she can autograph a book for you, and maybe you can have a chat. Thank you, this was terrific.